Hello everyone, I'm Nizzahon, and welcome to a new series I'm doing here on the Aether Hub, a series of videos examining the various bannings and restrictions Wizards has decided to make over the years. This is something of a pilot episode. If people like it, I will do more videos like it, so make sure you let us know your opinion in the comments and with the like button. In my non-YouTube life, I'm actually a historian. I study and teach about the Middle Ages. But, as you probably know if you've watched my top 10s on my channel or here on the Aether Hub, I also love talking about the history of Magic. In this series, I'm going to delve back into Magic's history, something I'm quite fond of discussing, and I'm going to talk about all of the bannings and restrictions in Magic's history and put them in their appropriate context to explain why the specific cards were banned and restricted. Today, we all know that there are banned and restricted lists, and we know when new announcements are coming, but this hasn't always been the case. Generally, bannings and restrictions occur when certain cards are deemed too powerful, creating an unbalanced and/or unfun environment in a particular format, but this is for competitive play, and competitive play in Magic didn't exist until 1994. In this video, I'm going to discuss all of the cards that were banned or restricted during the very first banned and restricted announcement, which came on January 25th of 1994, as a result of the fact that Wizards had just created organized play with a World Championship tournament planned for later in the year. So let's look at what cards were restricted in that first announcement. There were not very many bannings with this first announcement, but there were a ton of restrictions, so I want to cover those first. A restriction, by the way, means you can only have one copy of the card in your deck. To no one's surprise, this very first announcement included the Power 9. These cards all enabled stupid fast mana if they were allowed in a deck in normal quantities, and honestly they allow for stupid fast mana even when restricted. Just look at Vintage. Or in the case of Time Walk, it allowed you to do too powerful of a thing, which is take an extra turn for 2 mana. And in the case of Ancestral Recall, allowed you to draw too many cards for 2 little mana. 1. Sol Ring, while not traditionally a part of the Power 9, similarly allowed you to get way too much mana. And Time Vault, while also not usually considered a part of the Power 9, allowed you to take extra turns too easily, just like Time Walk did. All of those restrictions make sense. Even without any historical context at all of those cards are still considered very powerful today. However, the other restrictions are a little harder to understand, and a lot of them are even cards that your average Magic player today has never even heard of, and many of them do not look very powerful to today's Magic players, so let's go ahead and talk about those, starting with Ali from Cairo. Ali from Cairo is a 4-mana 0/1 that keeps your life total from dropping below 0, from damage anyway, as long as he is in play. While definitely a cool design, and the first effect like this we ever had, this is not a card that people would be excited about today were it reprinted. It dies to everything. It did then, too. Lightning Bolt was around. So the effect it gives isn't that great, and a 0/1 for 4 mana is just horrendous. We get things like Platinum Angel today, so we expect way cooler effects like this. But why did Wizards decide to restrict it in 1994? Well, it seems that Wizards just didn't like a card that could alter the game so heavily, essentially breaking one of the core rules of the game, that is that you die after you take 20 damage. Ali would be unrestricted just 2 years later in 1996, though, with Wizards seemingly realizing that he wasn't any real threat to competitive Magic, because no decks at the time or since were interested in playing him. Next we have Berserk. This one getting banned makes a little more sense, and indeed, were this card printed today, I think it would probably see some play in decks like Infect or Death Shadow Zoo. For a single green mana, it doubles your creature's power and gives it trample. Not too far off from Temur Battle Rage, though it does also kill your creature at the end of the turn. In general, Wizards made several restrictions in this announcement that they felt would help lengthen the game. This is why fast mana was restricted, and Berserk was the kind of card that could end a game rather quickly as well. Early Zoo decks ran the card, even after it was restricted, because it could deal massive amounts of damage quickly. The exact kind of thing an aggro deck wants to do. Attacking with your Shivan Dragon, let's say, and using Giant Growth and Berserk was not an uncommon thing to see in those days. That's 16 damage if you don't have any red mana to also pump your dragon, but obviously you do because you cast it. Berserk was eventually unrestricted, but not until 2003, in large part because the Eternal formats were not super creature-based anymore, and such a card wasn't as much of a threat as it was in the early years of Magic, so what I'm saying is I think Berserk probably did deserve to be restricted. Next, we have Brain Geyser. At sorcery speed, this could allow you to draw X cards or force your opponent to. This is really nothing special today. We're used to things like Sphinx's Revelation, which completely blows this out of the water. Yeah, it has one more mana other than X, but it gains you life, and it can do it at instant speed, and it's a ridiculous card. At the time, though, this effect was viewed as a little bit concerning and too good of card draw, just like Ancestral Recall was, which I know sounds insane because this costs 5 just to draw 3. This one is hard to understand, but it seems that Wizards may have had a bit of a knee-jerk reaction about powerful blue card draw once they sort of made the mistake of printing Ancestral Recall and just wanted to be safe here, even though this card did not see very much play. Worth noting that if one could generate infinite mana, you could mill your opponent to death with it, but there weren't a lot of ways to do that. Surprisingly enough, Brain Geyser remained restricted all the way until 2004. This despite the fact that plenty of other X card draw spells emerged in the years in between. And so I think Brain Geyser was kind of a mistake to ban, and in the end, it's never really seen a lot of play anyway. Now, if you thought Ollie from Cairo and Brain Geyser were weird choices, how about restricting Dingus Egg? 4 mana for an artifact that gives a player 2 life anytime one of their lands goes to the graveyard from play. This is basically the definition of unplayable to us today, but Wizards was concerned about people comboing this card with Armageddon. I'm not really sure why though, as it gains both players' life when all lands are destroyed, meaning it doesn't really make much of a difference. If it only gained you life, then maybe. Dingus Egg did not last long on the restricted list, becoming unrestricted just 4 months after it was restricted, indicating Wizards realized they made a mistake with this one. Another interesting choice to be restricted was Gauntlet of Mine. As we will see with some of the other bannings on this list, Wizards seem to have been a little concerned about red decks at the time, and Gauntlet of Mine is one of the cards that suffered for it. An Anthem effect for your whole team, coupled with ramping, is indeed quite powerful, and Gauntlet of Mine is still a staple in red EDH decks today. However, Wizards also unbanned this one in May of '94, and it never saw any play, so it seems like another mistake on Wizards' part. Next, we have Icy Manipulator, a card we've seen reprinted tons of times today, and certainly we don't think of as super powerful, though it is pretty good when it's unlimited. Being able to tap permanents for only 1 mana is nice, but it isn't insane. However, the rules at the time were a little bit different, and that made Icy Manipulator even better than it is now. Then, if an artifact was tapped, its user no longer got to use its effect, even if it was a static effect. It was effectively turned off, which meant you could use a Manipulator to do that. The fact it was colorless meant that basically everyone was running the Manipulator too, something that concerned Wizards. Even after it was restricted in '94, the card continued to see play as a singleton, putting up top 8s at Worlds in '94 and '95, and at the very first Pro Tour in 1996. So while this card seems like a serviceable one that isn't very exciting for Constructed today, it does seem like there was a very real reason to restrict this card at the time, if only to add some more diversity to the game. You can sort of think of it as the Smuggler's Copter of the time, and I know that's a little bit overblown, but it's a colorless card everyone was playing, and that didn't make for a very fun game. Weirdly enough, though, even though I think this restriction makes sense, a little more sense than many of the others on this list, this is another card Wizards decided to unrestrict just 2 months later in March of '94. It is somewhat strange that this was a card actually doing some work at the competitive level, and they decided to unrestrict it. Next, we have Orcish Oriflamme, which is kind of a weird case. At the time, there was no such thing as Gatherer and no Oracle text. This meant that cards simply did what was printed on them. When the Oriflamme was printed in Alpha, it was misprinted as only costing 2. While this was corrected in Beta, where it was changed to a converted mana cost of 4, it meant that anyone who had an older Oriflamme could play their 2 mana version legally. While Wizards was not super clear about the reason this card was restricted, I think the controversy over there being 2 different Oriflammes was a big part of it. It made them look kind of foolish for making the mistake in the first place, and they wanted to make sure nobody was playing the 2 mana version of Orcish Oriflamme, because really, Orcish Oriflamme isn't all that strong, and by today's standards is basically unplayable. It wasn't seeing any play at the time either, though we have already seen that they hated on red a little bit with the banning of Gauntlet of Mine, so maybe they really were worried about red. But the card was unrestricted just 1 month later in February of '94, indicating again that Wizards realized it wasn't a big enough deal to be restricted, even if it only cost 2 mana. So the final card that was restricted in this first announcement is actually one of my favorite Magic cards, Rook Egg. This card was a real flavor win in the early days of Magic. Being a 0/3 egg for 4 mana that when it hatched turned into a 4/4 Rook with flying was really cool. However, while it was a flavor win, Wizards screwed up on their wording of the card in its original printing, kind of like how they screwed up on Orcish Oriflamme. Remember how I mentioned there was no such thing as Oracle? Cards just did what they said, and Rook Egg said that if it goes to the graveyard, without specifying where, you got the 4/4 Rook. This meant you could just play nothing on turn 1 and discard the egg to get a 4/4 flyer on turn 1. That's insane in Magic of any era at all. Because of this mistake, they had to restrict this card too. The card would only remain restricted for a month though, with Wizards eventually establishing the Oracle to help deal with problems like this, rather than banning them. That does it for the restricted cards. There were a few cards that were banned as well, although in their case, none of them were really banned due to power level, but because they all did things to the game that people just didn't like. The two banned cards were Shahrazad and anti-cards. And I guess that's more than two cards because there's several anti-cards. But let's talk about Shahrazad first. This is a card that I think is pretty widely known in the community for how wacky it is. Yeah, that's a lot of text. The Oracle text makes it a lot easier to understand what's happening here, simply stating, players play a Magic subgame using their libraries as their decks. Each player who doesn't win the subgame loses half of his or her life rounded up. Yeah, that's wacky. You have to play a whole other game of Magic just to decide who is losing half of their life in the other game of Magic that you left behind. This is another card that is a real flavor win, I have to say. Arabian Nights is a pretty unique set in Magic because it had a lot of cards in it that reflected the real world, or that were reflections of literature in our world. Shahrazad is one of these cards. She is a character from 1001 Nights, an 8th century work of Arabic literature that has stood the test of time. It's the source of stories like Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves, and Aladdin and the Magic Lamp. And without going on too much more of a tangent here, Shahrazad is the narrator of all of these stories, and she tells a different story every night because her husband is this really mean guy who marries a different virgin every day and beheads them the next. Shahrazad keeps coming up with stories so as to avoid this beheading so that she remains a virgin, and thus this card is reflective of that sort of stalling, where she just keeps trying to tell stories to avoid her ultimate fate, and that's kind of what Shahrazad does. So, yes, while a flavor win, this card was a complete nightmare, making games unnecessarily long, and Wizards wanted to ban it to just avoid having to deal with this in organized play. And I think that was a wise decision. It would be a terrible thing to have to watch people play. The other cards that were banned were the anti-cards. Originally, there was intended to be some high stakes associated with the game of Magic, or at least the option of these high stakes, that essentially made the game gambling. You had to put up the top card of your library as the ante for the game, and if you lost the game, you lost that card. There were several cards printed that interacted with cards in this ante zone, and these are all banned. And ante was removed from the rules of the game altogether because it was a major contentious aspect of the game that most players just didn't like. Losing the game was bad enough, you didn't need to lose cards too, and having this element of gambling in the game also wasn't going to appeal to parents whose kids wanted to play the game. Well, that does it. I've covered all the cards that were banned and restricted with the first announcement in January of '94. Remember, this is something of a pilot episode. If you enjoyed this, look back into the early days of the banned and restricted list and want to see me continue throughout the timeline of Magic, like, comment, and share this video. Thanks for watching.